you're the government of Greece, and the central bank doesn't buy your bonds, then it's got to be the private sector. And if none of them want to buy them, despite the fact that perhaps the ECB will take them in a repo, then you're stuck at the first stage of the government spending.
Just to clarify, the ECB is based on the legacy of the Bundesbank. And the Bundesbank, before the euro, didn't use government bonds to conduct its open market operations, used corporate bonds. And this is a strictly German central banking philosophy that's being imposed and transported in the ECB. And to go back to your earlier point, to clarify, the no bailout, no purchasing of, no bailout and no exit clauses are in the Maastricht Treaty, not in the ECB charter.
Yeah.
But in practice, it's the German central bankers, the former Bundesbankers who are now at the ECB, who refuse to accept this otherwise common practice of using government bonds, either directly or in the secondary market, unless when they're pushed against the wall in the last few months.
Yeah.
Two quick things. One for Steve. Ava Lerner, in his famous 1943 paper and in his 1951 book, The Economics of Employment, describes this process of the interest rate falling, contrary to the conventional wisdom. Just a quick from his 1951 book: the spending of money out of deficits keeps on increasing the stock of money, and this keeps on pushing down the rate of interest. Somehow, the government must prevent the rate of interest from being pushed down by the additions to the stock of money coming from its own expenditures. There's an obvious way of doing this. The government can borrow back the money it is spending. So Lerner really, understood, all of this thing. And then I just had one other point. And I'll put it in like a question. So if the private sector didn't want to buy the bonds, so the government wants, to drain the reserves, then the interest rate could go to zero or fall very low, or isn't an equivalent alternative to just pay interest on reserves like in some other countries, and we do it in the U.S. And now we do it in the U.S. So I mean, I think that the idea about other countries are different and so on. I mean, of course, we have to. We shouldn't want to replace the conventional approach is always a cookie cutter approach, one size fits all, and this is the way a system operates under a very specific set of institutional, political, and legal arrangements. But I think also small modifications can then help to apply to other countries' situations, or we can also understand their system by how it differs from this, this layout. That's my
yeah. Okay, yeah. I think we're going to be going, some late nights are going to come our way, quite possibly. Okay, but I'll start the same thing Mark did and start in reference from Randy's paper, where I differ, and mainly I agree, by the way. But, pardon? I will be, but not straight away. So, certainly right down to the stage of the simple model, multiple banks, no problem. What I think is an error, in terms of, my objective in what I'm doing is trying to derive a new approach to macroeconomics. And I think it has to be one that includes both private bank behaviour and central bank behaviour, government and so on. I would, rather than having subject, I'd embed the simple model of multiple banks where subject is. I think one of the areas where we have to improve what's been done by modern monetary theory, as I have to improve what I've done in monetary circuit theory, is to properly incorporate private banking money creation in that model, and I've got to properly incorporate government creation in mine, which I haven't yet done. So I'd rather see subject replaced by the simple model. And I agree with Mark about the unfortunate use of the word. Yeah? Yeah, pardon?
What are you talking about?
Okay, look, it's the two-dot model. We've got the sovereign and subject. Okay? I think rather than subject, let's whack in the whole simple model of a pure, that is the model up to the fourth one, there is a pure credit economy, which is where circuit theory began from and didn't incorporate government money creation. So I'd embed that where subject currently occurs. Because that's just, we need to have that level of disaggregation. And that there, pardon? Yeah. What that then, pardon? Yeah, I'd be embedding all of the fourth graph in subject, where subject is in figure 5. Okay? Well, no, sorry, central bank I'd have as a, I'd embed it and I'd rotate it minus 90 degrees to put CB in sovereign, okay? That's, if you think, looking at that arrangement, the CB is there functioning as the clearinghouse between private banks, which could be done, as Mark has said and I've said, by a private institution if you have a pure credit economy. But it's not. It's done by the government body. So that's like where the link is. You'd rotate that 90 degrees, slot CB into sovereign, and then you... Pardon? That's where what I think is a lack of detail here. Okay, I wouldn't use the word leveraging. I think that's a very misleading word for the straight to think money multiplier. And that's something we have to kill somehow. And I think this is keeping money multiplier alive just by using a term that sounds like money multiplier. So I'd really like you to get rid of the word leveraging. Find another word.
You're with Mark. People don't like that terminology. Is it disliking the idea that reserves serve as reserve ratio serves as a constraint on the amount of bank money outstanding? Or
Yes.
It's a whole range. It's that in a whole range. I think it implies that what happens is the reserves are multiplied through the system. Like physically, yeah. It's
so we have bank deposits in excess of reserves, of central bank reserves. So there is if you think of the multiplier as simply a ratio of deposits to central bank reserves, then there is a multiplier. But you're saying that the term multiplier implies something more than that.
well, my favourite there is Obama's speech. Yeah,
In France,
I think
in France they used to speak of the monetary divisor.
Yeah,
Because you start.
That's a better way of putting it.
You divide and then you get the monetary.
If you
go on, Fred and look up M1 money multiplier, it's just the ratio of M1 to.
But there's a causal proposition behind it. It comes back to the point you were making earlier about tautology versus model. And it is a model. And like the way Mark puts it in his paper, he talks about how the government creates that money and they might have, 100 injected, 90 left over. And that therefore means that the reserves have to be 9, so 81 has to be taken out of the system. That's the correct way of doing it. But what people think in the money multiplier, my favourite instance is Obama's speech back in 2009, I think, was explaining his policy. And he said at one point, and you could just see Summers would have coached him on this, said, people say to me, why am I bailing out the banks? Where's my bailout, they ask. That's literally a quote. And he says, the truth is that $1 of extra money into the banking system generates another $8 to $10. A multiplier effect, straight.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so that's what we want to get, and that's why I find the word leveraging.
I've always thought it's just a ratio.
But it's actually seen as causal. In the conventional textbook argument, it causes.
Think of it mechanistic.
Okay, and if he was right, of course, the $1 trillion additional stimulus would have been $10 trillion more debt. So that's great. So the word leverage I'd like to remove, definitely. As I've got my modern MCT, modern monetary circuit theory models of a pure credit economy, I want to now embed the government in there as well. That does lead to one issue. And again, there's an implication in some of the language that the amount of money creation by the government sector constrains what can be created by the private sector. Like you're saying, the deficit of the public sector is the private sector surplus. That is lumping together the banks and the non-banks. And I think that is an error, logically, because that then implies there's some constraint on what the banks can lend to the non-banks, which is not so.
Why is there no constraint?
Pardon? because if the government is running a surplus, it's still possible for the non-bank sector to go into deficit to the banks. And that's what I want to illustrate by bringing up my software package Minsky, which I've been leading to here. And I'm trying to get some of this together. A large part of this is that we don't have a way, haven't had a way, of actually accounting for these flows in a logical framework. So this is I've actually got 3 models I'm going to bring up here and show very quickly. If I had lots of time, I'd take you through how to build a model. What's actually going on here is behind each of these icons is a double entry view of the operations of a banking system. And you can have any number. As you can see, I've got 2 there, one for the central bank and one for the private banks. And what I'm starting from this point of view is the modern monetary circuit theory model, where I'm saying that you can have the private bank having 2 types of assets, loans it makes to the non-banks and reserves. And then 2 types of, pardon me, a mistake there, make that a liability, and that a liability, okay, so that there's lending is shown as an increase in the loan, and show the way the system shows you get the accounting correct, it shows the liabilities as negatives. So each of those rows sum to 0, and this is not quite a wide enough display to show that, so I'll see if I can stretch this over and show that there's a row sum operation being done by the software to make sure you get your elements right. So if you make a mistake, like for example, if I have lend W and I have lend, let's say I've got lend, I put WC there just by accident, then the system will go through and show that I've got an error. So unless I actually, if I make a mistake like that, then I can just go back and say, well, let's just get rid of that. And now it tells me my accounting is correct. So it's capturing the double entry for you, making sure you don't make errors. So what I've got is a very simple system here, which is a private banking system. Loans created by the banking sector create the, now there's a mistake. Now I've got lend F on the wrong row. I'm just doing this while we're talking earlier. I've actually built this model, the 3 of them I'm going to show you while we were talking the first 1.5 hours. That's in the wrong place. Now it's in the right place. Okay. So it's possible to, change your accounting, move columns around, etc., etc. And you can see what's been going on here. The lending by the banking sector creates the deposits in both the firms and the workers. The repayment reduces it. So that's a perfectly straightforward, pure credit economy, which is not what we live in. Okay? But that's a starting point. So there's lots more to show behind the program. What I will illustrate quickly is that I normally do simulation work. I'm trying to build mathematical models of the system. So a huge part of this is to build mathematical models with numerical systems to simulate. But I also want to get the logic right. So it's possible to output the equations. We haven't yet integrated this properly into the software to show you within the program itself. But once you've done that, so let's bring up a window here. Once you've done that, you can then see what in fact your equations are. So if I bring that up now, that's down here, I think. Yeah, I've just saved that file. I can now load it. And let's make it a bit bigger. Get rid of that window. And see what my flow equations are. So I can actually interpret this saying this is the flows of money in, money out, creation of money, and so on. So this is a tool I'd like you all to start using, by the way. Any ways you want to redesign it, tell me. Finance my program, or it can be designed. Because I want to see this as a general tool for us to build a strictly monetary approach to macroeconomics. That's stage 1. Let's just load one more model. Of course, you notice I've got Godly 1 over here. These are all called Godly tables, but I really don't believe I would have thought this out except for 2 interventions. One is working with Wynne when I was working on the first edition of Debunking Economics. And the second is when I gave the first paper, remember that rather lively session at the Kansas City, when Scott came out and said, you must have made a mistake in the double entry bookkeeping. I thought, well, I know I didn't make a mistake mathematically, but I wasn't doing double entry either, and I've learned the importance of that over time. So I thought, I wonder if I can show my equations in book form, and that's where it all came from. So to honour Wynne, that's why I've called these Godly tables.
Which Godly?
Win Godley.
Oh, you said Scott?
Pardon?
You said Scott.
Scott Fulbert.
Oh,
Who should be here, but it didn't happen. So that's one model. Now, let's see if I can find a second. Again, I'm just trying to demonstrate what can be done with the software, not so much what my views are, but what's feasible. I'm missing, oh, there we go, there's number 2. So what I've added here now is I've got government spending and government social security turning up in the system. And I'll just bring up that particular table. And what's now happening is that dynamic that MMT talks about, where government spending has to pass through reserves to end up turning up down here. I bring up the private bank here. The government spending credits the reserves here, and what the program forces you to do, and I'll try to demonstrate this now, is that I've just got government spending, like buying from firms, government welfare, transfer payments to households. If I add an additional row here, and I say this is taxation or taxing firms, then I'm going to show over here, and this is a positive, there's an entry here, positive is debiting a liability account, so money's been taken out by putting a positive here. So if I say, for example, tax underscore F there, then to balance the row, and again, this display's not wide enough to show, but it's now showing a minus. It's showing that I've got a plus, a positive sum there. So I've got to balance that to be a negative here. So I now type minus tax underscore F here. Then that makes that particular table consistent. What's also happening, however, is that that's now been added over here as an entry on the reserves for the central bank. So you've now got, as you can now see, the row sum here is now positive. So again, to make the accounting correct, I've got to put a negative in there, and I've got to show that as the liability that the Treasury owes to the central bank has fallen. So I have minus tax underscore F, underscore F here, and the program then works out, says, yep, that's correct. Okay, and I've then now got the complete logic there. So the final one I want to show, and bear in mind, I've wanted to do this for some time, but I'm usual time pressure. I haven't had it. So I actually did all these during the conversation we've had so far this morning. Hang on, wrong one. Let's get the Minsky model instead. Where's number 3? There we go. Okay. So this, you can see the bank's icon's got a bit bigger. We've got to control all the scaling and things like that over time. But I've now got the entire dynamic of lending by the private sector to both households and firms, repayment of debt by both households and firms, government spending and taxation, etc., etc. And you can then put it together and say, what is the overall situation for the amount of money in the economy? And this is now I'm using another part of the program, which is the same technology which is being developed 30 or 40, oh, actually, how long ago? 50 years ago by Jay Forrester to use flowcharts to build dynamic models. Now, I've got to get this in here. Did anybody see the Twitter war I had with Noah Opinion, Noah Smith, where he challenged he said, thinking of writing a post about Keynes' absurd Minsky program, worth it, question mark. I'd actually come back, flown back into the country that day, and I was going down with my nephew's graduation, so turning up on the train on the way down. And I said, any neoclassical challenging a dynamic system is in for a fight, mate. So off we go on the damn thing. And then he's made a comment that I made him realize is completely naive about the software tradition going back 50 years. And software packages in this technology sell for up to $20,000 a copy. And major corporations buy hundreds of copies of that software. So it's seriously important commercial software. And he said, what do the wires do? What the wires do, which are these arrows you can see joining the various objects together around here, they assign values to variables. They're equations. So that's literally saying government social security plus government spending is gov in total, and government tax of workers and firms is total tax, and the difference between the two is the deficit. And equally saying what money is, it's the money in the account the banks themselves have, their equity in the system, the workers' bank accounts and the firm's bank accounts, and that's the amount of money. And with that logic, you can then say, okay, what is the overall rate of change of the money supply? Which I haven't yet built it so it actually interprets one of those equations directly for me, but if you add together change in workers' accounts, change in banks' accounts, change in firms, you've got the total. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Only the section that's the money they've earned by the gap between what they pay on deposits and what they earn on loans. So not their assets. I'm seeing I call it a safe normally, because the classic accounting equation is assets minus liabilities equal equity. So every entity, including you and me, has that equation in their overall sum. So the banks have got it as well. Now, do they spend out of it, et cetera, et cetera? At the moment, I'm treating it like a 19th century bank with a safe. So technically speaking, I should have to make that more elaborate and talk about part which becomes part of their capital, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a rigid part of the model that I'm doing, but it's certainly, to make the accounting correct, I've got to say you have assets and liabilities. Every entity also has equity potential. That's all that's really going on there. If I made the model more elaborate, that it might well drop out, and you might just have firms and workers there as the source of the money. But at the moment, the way I've designed it in this very simple model, then yes, it is part of the money supply in this simple model. So my intention ultimately is to make this a way that we can actually do dynamic monetary modeling. I'm not demonstrating a simulation there, but I'll see if I've got one. Let's see, that'll do. This is having a bit of a go at loanable funds and showing how loanable funds actually operates. And again, it's hard to see. Let's make it scale a bit smaller there so I can zoom in. But this is actually putting loanable funds putting flesh on loanable funds and showing what that means, and showing that if you rapidly change the lending, it has no effect on the behaviour of the economy. Okay, rapidly reduce it, no check whatsoever. So it's possible even to model systems you don't believe in this, including loanable funds, which I've done there. But the main use I'd see as being for the people in bringing together MMT and MCT is that it lets us work out what the flow logic is, which we need to do if we're going to get beyond the stage of verbal models and get to the stage where it provides mathematical alternatives. Now, there's more that I can talk about where I want to clarify other issues in macroeconomics, but I might leave that later and leave it at that point for now.
So I'm thinking that maybe what we should do is take this whole thing and then come back and actually have some, say, substantive discussion, half hour discussion, and then sort of flow into functional comments.